welcome to our first session on arpeggios. So first off, what is an arpeggio? Well, an arpeggio is just the notes of a chord played in sequence to create a fragment of melody. So in the case of a simple triad arpeggio, this is simply the root, third and fifth of the chord, and normally we return to the root at the octave to complete it. In the case of a seventh chord, of course the notes are root, third, fifth, seventh, and octave. Here's a major seventh arpeggio. The great thing about using arpeggios to create a melody is that the arpeggio contains only chord tones, so it's guaranteed not to clash with the notes of the chord. And indeed it's possible to build a simple melody using just arpeggio patterns. Of course this is somewhat limiting, and later in the series we're looking at how we use scale notes and indeed even notes from outside the key altogether to fill in the spaces between the chord tones and make more complicated and interesting melodies. For the moment we're sticking with arpeggios, and I'd like to start by taking a look at arpeggios in the open position. Now by open position we mean that the four fingers of the left hand are covering the first four frets on the fretboard, and open strings are used where available. I'll use the term open position to include any fingering pattern which uses the four fingers on the first four frets, regardless of whether or not any open strings are actually involved. Now the topic of arpeggios, and indeed scales and modes in the open position, is one that I think is a little bit neglected in the literature. Most guitar tutors put the emphasis on playing melody lines using no open strings, and there are some extremely good reasons for this. First off, a note played on the open string is perceptibly different in tone from the same note played on a fret. So if you're playing a melody line with a mixture of fretted notes and open strings, it will naturally tend to sound a little bit uneven. Secondly, fretting a note gives you more control over the dynamics of the note. That's the loudness and duration of the note. It means you can avoid having any unwanted notes ringing in between the rest of the melody. And finally, fretting a note allows you to use expressive techniques such as vibrato, string bending, muting, and left-hand articulation such as hammer-ons, pull-offs, and trills. In spite of this, I think it's worth familiarising yourself with the open position arpeggios and scales. Personally, I think this particularly applies if you're a singer accompanying yourself on the guitar, playing mainly chords, and most especially if your chords tend to be in or near the open position. You can use the open position arpeggios and scales to fill in between the chords. Here's a very simple example. There are a couple of advantages to using the open position arpeggios and scales along with open position chords in playing an accompaniment. One is that you can often leave some of the chord tones ringing while you play the melody line, so the harmony doesn't completely drop away while the tune is playing. But most importantly, because your hand is staying in one position and pretty much always using the same finger on the same fret, you always know where your left hand is, and you can focus more of your attention on your performance, that is your vocals and the dynamic and expressive elements of your playing. And because you're not tempted to be constantly looking at the guitar to check your left hand position, it allows you to maintain eye contact and keep a rapport with your audience, or perhaps with your fellow musicians if you're playing in a duo or a band. So all in all, it's worth familiarising yourself with all the patterns in the open position. Now, as with the chord fingerings, actually showing you the individual fingerings for all the open position arpeggios and scales is going to be beyond the scope of this series. However, you should have enough information here to enable you to work them out for yourself. Of course, if you want to save yourselves the effort, you could always consider buying the book. Now let's move on to playing the arpeggios without any open strings, and in this case I like to practice arpeggios and indeed scales and pentatonics, other melodic patterns, in 9 different positions. First begins with the second finger of the left hand on the 6th or bottom string, and here is a major triad arpeggio. You'll notice here that the 5th and the octave fall in the same fret space on adjacent strings, and I'm here using my little finger to play both. If your little finger is a bit small or perhaps not very flexible, you can always use your 3rd finger to play the 5th. So there's our major triad arpeggio. Here's the minor triad. This involves a stretch to the minor 3rd, and our minor flat 5 triad, a major 7th, a dominant 7th, a minor 7th, and a minor 7 flat 5. Okay, so that's one position. The next position begins on the 1st finger on the lowest string, and in this position we stretch for the major 3rd to play the major and dominant forms. So major triad, 1, 3, 5, octave, minor triad, 1, 3, 5, octave, and minor flat 5, 1, 3, 5, octave, the major 7th, 1, 3, 5, 7, octave, dominant 7th, 1, 3, 5, 7, octave, minor 7th, 1, 3, 5, 7, octave, and the minor 7 flat 5, 1, 3, 5, 7, octave. The 3rd position involves starting with the 4th finger on this lowest string. So here we can play major triad, minor triad, minor flat 5 triad, major 7th, dominant 7th, minor 7th, and finally the minor 7 flat 5. Okay, the next set of positions involves using the same starting fingers but on the 5th string, so I won't go through all the options here, but here we have major triad beginning on the 2nd finger, the 1st finger, and the 4th finger. Always remembering that as soon as you reach the 2nd string, the fingering has to adjust to accommodate the fact that this string is tuned to a different interval. And finally we have the equivalent set of fingerings beginning on the 4th string. Once again, for now I'll just go through the major triads. So, 2nd finger, 1st finger, and here something slightly different. For these fingerings I often find it more convenient to use the 3rd rather than the 4th finger. So that's our 9 positions for single octave arpeggios, and we can combine these patterns to extend the arpeggios over 2 octaves. I'll just play a few quick examples. Here's a major triad, a minor triad starting on the 1st finger, a dominant 7th, starting on the second finger. Bearing in mind that there may well be some position changes involved, especially if you're beginning on the 4th or 5th strings. Okay, now we've learned the shapes of the arpeggios, it's time to think about how to practice them. And the normal way we go about this is to take each arpeggio shape and practice it ascending, descending, and cycling back and forth. And the same for the 7th arpeggios. Let's do it with the major 7th, ascending, descending, and back and forth. When it comes to practicing the sequences of arpeggios corresponding to our chord progressions, we can practice them in the same way. So for example, taking a 1-4-5 progression in Triad arpeggios, we can play all the arpeggios ascending, descending, and back and forth. And that's where we're going to pick up in our next video, looking at the 1-4-5 major key progression in arpeggios. So until then, keep well and goodbye.